everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's me, CJ. You're watching CJ. I thought I would put an end to the discourse. I thought I would put a definition on a term that's been floating around. I thought I would name the importance of language and assigning meaning to syntax. I thought I would talk about the DWM. Today I want to talk about my favorite trope in literary fiction, mostly exist in literary fiction in the context of this video, which I have named the depressed woman moving. So that is already short for the depressed woman moving through the world, but I thought that would be an obnoxious acronym. So we shortened it, and we shortened it again with DWM, right? If you are new to my channel, if you watch any adjacent literary fiction booktubers that I'm friends with and in conversation with, you might have heard that term before. I made it up. It's just like a silly little acronym for what I want to describe and break down as my favorite trope, my favorite trope to read about. Why is it a trope? I think it's because it's so pervasive in contemporary literature now, and especially since some commercial success of books that utilize it, I think I've read more and more books akin to it. I think it's a generational thing. I think it's a millennial thing. I think it's a specific tone of voice and writing and thinking through the world that is making the DWM more ubiquitous. Let's say that. Is that what we should say? Okay. That sounded smart, right? Ubiquitous? I said, let me present my thesis. This is my thesis. In short, a depressed woman moving book, a DWM book, is about a woman who is depressed and moving through the world. I would say these novels are usually plotless. I was talking through this earlier with a friend. Can a DWM have a plot? I almost think no. Please write me in the comments if you disagree with that. But the main examples of the books that I've chosen to highlight at the end of this video that do DWM the best are pretty much plotless. So it just only furthers my theory of being anti-plot, right? I'm drawn to these books in general for a couple of reasons. One is it makes me feel seen, you know? I'm not trying to act like being a depressed, privileged white woman is some kind of rare breed. Cue that TikTok sound of talking about endangered species. But I would say through books, through literature, through looking at depictions of depression that show not only the highs and the lows, but the minutia of what living with mental illness looks like and means, I've found it pretty affirming. And I mean, we always like for our lived experience to be seen, right? So I would say number one, that's a reason I'm drawn to this genre as someone who has mental illness myself and suffers with depression. It's cool to know I'm not alone on this floating rock. I would also say another reason I like this trope is because it's an homage, a celebration of almost like the rich interior emotional lives of women, which in the canon have been left out, right? So I feel like being able to connect with characters within literature in a really interior space, a really personal, temporal space is significant and hasn't always been available to us. And I think living in the time and age we are now, it's exciting that it's getting so ubiquitous, like we said earlier, right? I also like that DWM books tend to show the extremity and the dark-sidedness of human behavior and human thought and human relationships. Some of these books I'm going to mention later like go there. They really aren't afraid of giving us a morally great character, an unlikable character, just really bringing to surface all of the things that aren't usually attributed to what would be considered a protagonist in a novel, right? So I really like that. And finally, I guess I would say I like reading DWMs because they're usually written by women. In fact, none of the books I'm going to mention were written by men. So, you know, another stake at trying to diversify my reading, trying to read marginalized voices, and be more equitable with what I'm putting in my brain and consuming. Big caveat consideration is that this genre is on the cusp of white privileged whininess, I would say, which I think is a reflection of publishing as itself. I think is a reflection of me picking up titles that I'm being lazy and not searching for those more marginalized voices. So I think that is my one critique of this as a genre, is it can become a little too esoteric and a little too philosophical, which can definitely be annoying to read about, because I guess there's like two worlds that we live in. It's like the real world where things have real problems, and this like literature mind space where people can just move around their cities all day thinking about the meaning of life and philosophical ennui and, I guess, existential dread, right? Like I said earlier, I think a DWM is usually plotless, but some themes that are common when this trope is being employed, I would say, are familial relationships, romantic or sexual relationships, climate crisis, existential dread, navigating love in all of its forms, the concept of identity, the idea of identity, specifically self-identity, self-reliance, and I guess this larger, more meta theme of wrestling with an idea on paper and being able to work through kind of sentence by sentence, thought by thought with the narrator on a page. Being able to see in action the thought happening. Is that vague enough? Does that make sense? So this list of DWMs that I want to walk through are not comprehensive. I think a lot more books that I've read could fit into this highlight reel, but I've really tried to single it down to what really I think is like the quintessential essence of a DWM with all of these books, and I'm splitting it up into two categories, one being fiction and one being nonfiction. So here we go. First up, we have The Life of the Mind by Christine Smallwood. I can't think of a better case study of a DWM than this book. It's quite literally about a depressed woman moving through her academic life, moving through her personal relationships, moving through her identity as mother, as academic, and absolutely nothing happens. We follow Dorothy, I believe is the narrator's name. She recently suffered from a miscarriage. We are, as a reader, privy to a lot of her private thoughts, the interior landscape of her brain as she is moving through her week and her ins and out of her daily life while not telling anyone that this miscarriage has occurred, right? I think this book was stunning. It really leaned into the academia aspect of DWMs that I really enjoy reading about, kind of this interrogation of what it means to be in academic spaces and study on a higher level at all. I think it was really beautifully well done and had excellent writing. Another DWM I loved, have made many people in my life read is Luster by Raven Leilani. It's a little bit more fantastical in the writing than I would say is usually attributed to a DWM, but all in a purpose to serve and highlight the absurdity of our character's journey of where she's ended up in life and the events that are unfolding that are seemingly at random. Follow a young Black woman who is an artist living in Brooklyn who becomes entangled in a marital relationship, and we explore themes of art making, identity, race, sex, and family. It's gorgeous. Nothing happens. I love that book. Okay, a new to me book that I recently read, The Performance by, what is that author's name? By Claire Thomas. The Performance by Claire Thomas. This was a really interesting book that I think plays with narrative structure a little bit more than the other DWMs I have mentioned. It is set in the context of a playhouse and broken up into 3 main characters that we follow throughout the entirety of the book. They're all at different stages of being depressed women. They're all at different stages of moving through their lives in the world. I think this book is really interesting because it plays with some more formal elements of like playwriting and thinking through those structures, using that as a device alongside of us just like very much so being in the interior of these 3 women's minds. Big themes of climate change in this book, as well as sinking. Okay, there's a lot of metaphorical writing here and also mirroring of that metaphoric writing on the stage of the play that these women are watching, of helplessness, sinking. It's kind of like an atmospheric, vibey book that feels heavy and a little bit subdued. From a mood setting aspect, this book is really good at nailing that on the head. Then we have Assembly by Natasha Brown, a newer release. I got immediate DWM vibes from this book. It all takes place over a condensed period of time, I think 3 days. I would say that's almost a theme throughout all of the pieces of fiction in this book. They're all quick. There's a sense of time about them. There's a hastiness. There's kind of that tension between hastiness and longing, to be honest. As a reader, you can definitely pick that up and feel that tension and that energy, I would say. But Assembly follows a Black woman living in Britain who is, again, in her mind, just really interrogating and wrestling and decontextualizing all of the events and pieces of her identity and her life that have led her to this very moment. It's kind of a book that's introspective and thinking through class stereotypes, race, inherited wealth, autonomy over one's body as a Black person, and the right to move through the world on your own terms. Yeah. And then lastly, we have Death in Her Hands by Atessa Moshfegh. A book being Moshfeghian, if you hear that, I would say that is a calling card for being a DWM. They speak to one another but are not analogous. Let's say that. Death in Her Hands follows an elderly woman. A DWM can be any age, hello, and she is isolated in the woods and is going crazy. I think a lot of DWMs have an element of self-interrogation that almost becomes abusive to a point, like almost emotionally abrasive, right? And Death in Her Hands exemplifies that to the nth degree. I really liked the atmospheric writing of this book. I liked the loneliness and depiction of this solitary older woman living in this cabin alone. And I think the larger ideas played with in this book are really smart and just further uphold this trope at large. Those are all the fiction books that have DWM vibes. Some DWM nonfiction books. Joan Didion. I mean, can't think of a better description of a depressed woman moving through the world than Joan Didion. A lot of her reporting is centered in place, right? It's about specific geographic locations. You get a sense of the environment as well as a perception of what her mood was when she was in these spaces with these people. I think I've read a lot. I think I've read like almost every Joan Didion piece of nonfiction, and even from the range of more personal accounts that are biographical and about her life, which focus on like the death of her daughter and the death of her husband, to that more reportage 60s California vibe, all have that kind of sense of detachment and that holding of your own personal opinion and what's going on in your brain as you're thinking through the world in a larger context. Love. Blueberries by Elena Savage. I'll say some similar things about that book. We have a woman who is interrogating larger structures that she has inherited in what this world has become, and also thinking through some like of her inherited biases and personal experiences and matching them together. Gorgeous writing, moody, evocative. We love to see it. And then I would say Deborah Levy, The Cost of Living specifically. I haven't read Real Estate in the Living Autobiography, but that book was very DWM. So banal, and a lot of it was just genuinely about how to survive and move through the day with a turbulent emotional landscape due to events happening in her life. And it was entrancing. It was entrancing, and it was gorgeous, and it was personal but distant at the same time, and I love that tension. So that's it. That's my think piece on DWMs. She's a problematic fave, baby. I think she's getting more diversified as she ages. I'm wondering if you have any recommendations that would fit into this genre. Specifically nonfiction, specifically memoir, I would say, is what I am yearning to read through and think through the most. Fiction accompaniments for this genre are wide, but I would love some nonfic recommendations if you have them. Cool. That's my DWM video. Love ya, DWMs.